What's up, guys? Today we have a special collaboration with Lyle McDonald. He's someone who is in the fitness industry for a long time. He's one of the first who brought evidence-based nutrition training to the field, and the evidence-based community is really big now. So you have a lot of people you can learn from. Lyle McDonald has been in the game for so long, and I read a lot of his articles and I learned a lot from him. And you guys mostly learned from me, so time to learn from a real expert. Timestamps are down below. If you really want to learn something, give this podcast a shot because it is just awesome. We talked about stubborn fat loss, how to lose your stubborn fat, water retention during a diet, supplements, and cardio, how to implement it the right way. And guys, what I do is all for free. I don't earn any money for this. Only thing I will ask you is to like the video and leave a comment for the algorithm, and also subscribe, of course. Enjoy. Yes, what's up, guys? Welcome to the video. Today I have in front of me Lyle McDonald, the guy who knows everything about fitness and nutrition. I'm very, I already want to thank you in advance for taking the time and having this conversation with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm very excited. And for the viewers, English is my second language, so I'm going to do my absolute best, like I say every podcast. So Lau will help me out when I am stuck. But Lau, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. And I wanted to comment. I've been on the internet a long time. Whenever someone says, excuse my English, or whatever, it's my second language, usually they speak better English than the people I know in my own country, or as frequently as not. So yeah, you're perfectly fine. I always just find that I've seen it. It's so common. But anyway, so no, I'm well down here in Austin, Texas, just watching the world burn like everybody else.
How's the situation there?
It's a lot like the rest of everywhere. The cases are going up. We've been sort of under semi-lockdown, and luckily I work at home, don't have a big social life. It didn't really impact me, and I'm lucky enough, like many, to work online. So it's not like I got impacted supremely by this. It certainly has been strange. Just this whole situation. When it all started, and kind of, I don't know, it was very humbling. I lived in America my whole life, and I realized how spoiled we are.
Yeah.
Because going to the grocery store, standing in line, or going and seeing that, I couldn't buy whatever I wanted whenever I wanted, or whatever I wanted whenever I wanted, was very unusual. And it kind of occurred to me, and like, that's how people in many other countries live all the time. And
yeah.
it was really sort of eye-opening to me. 1 second.
Yeah. It's
so yeah, but I mean, it's just been weird. I guess now, just, I don't know, like, whatever, the new joke, it's the new normal, I guess at this point. But yeah, it was just a strange transition, and not being able to, just not having the freedom that, like I said, as a lifelong, having lived in the US, I've gotten so accustomed to.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't things I wanted to do, just knowing that I couldn't do them is just weird. But like I said, I think it was good. It was just kind of like, oh wow, this is how a lot of the rest of the world lives all the time. So yeah, and now everything is just kind of back to normal, I guess.
So gyms are also open at the moment?
I think, yeah, they're reopened. I actually haven't gone back to mine. I get most of my workout. I train a female powerlifter named Sumi Singh, who's very well known online. Loading her weights is really, really my workout right now, and that's plenty because I know how gross gyms were before all of this. People don't wipe down equipment. I realize that there's been very few cases from the gym, but I can do stuff at home. I can do my own thing, but at some point I will certainly rejoin a gym. But at the moment, I'm perfectly happy. I said, I load her weights 6 days a week, and that's plenty. So,
what do you do for job? Is it full coaching?
Most of what I do is writing and online. I coach her, although honestly, she's almost a full-time job. She trains a lot. Her workouts take a long time. So, I did the coaching thing for many, many, many years, and I prefer writing because I can just kind of get the information out there. And I'm always kind of working on books, and they eventually get done and all that sort of thing. So I tend to just, like I said, it's a lot more, I think, online stuff. I'm also doing consultations now, just kind of one-off types of things. That keeps me busy enough.
Yeah. And what got you into lifting, and where does the passion come from? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, so I'm old. I was born in 1970, and so I grew up really before the internet age. I was active I did all the sports as a kid. That was typical American upbringing. I played soccer, I played baseball, I actually played football one year, which I was not cut out for, but I was still basically a sedentary little kid. Both my parents were musicians, played a lot of video games because that was really starting. I grew up in arcades and home video games, ate sort of the typical, suburban diet, and I was, chubby little kid. I get to high school, and we had mandatory athletics every semester, every 6 weeks. We had to do a sport. Some of it, we could do what we call, intramurals, which could be whatever, volleyball, whatever. We could do an actual sport. I ran cross country, tried to run track one year. I was on the swim team, and one year I had that, and I got into bike riding, and it was just kind of one of those things where I started to see these physical changes, and it was just that's all I cared about. It was just kind of, there's an old saying, your passion picks you. And I started doing this, and I also had a weight training class at my high school. And I was like, this is what I want. I don't know. It was just this is what I want to do. Got a membership to one of the local gyms, an old Nautilus gym. And this is, this is the dark ages. This is 1985, 86. The gyms were not what they are now. They had a Nautilus line of equipment. They had a little free weight area.
Yeah.
Aerobics floors, all that kind of stuff. And, then I also got into martial arts at one point through a friend of my mother's. And I just kind of suddenly that was all I wanted to do. I raced some early triathlons because I'd already run. I rode a bike. I knew how to swim. And then I got into gymnastics my senior year of high school. And originally wanted to go to college to be a gymnastics coach. And then while I was so I went to study exercise physiology at UCLA. And my interest shifted. At one point I wanted to be a physical therapist because I got injured and I had to go to physical therapy, and I thought they have the coolest toys. And then about 91, 92, I got into inline skating, which that was when that really started to take off, and started racing. And I was kind of one of those people that I was a decent athlete, but I wanted to be better. And I read all the magazines, would go bother my professors who would tell me just how ridiculous all this stuff was. And they, and I started going down to the biomedical library. So I would train.
So there was not a lot of evidence-based information about training, nutrition, etc.
Not really. This was the muscle magazines would usually, they would cite research studies and take things out of context. One of the magazines made up a study reference that they claimed had been done at UCLA, which is where I went to school, that was an outright lie. Right? They just invented a study that never happened to support one of their supplements. And UCLA actually took them to court, and there was a whole big to-do. really the only magazine at that point that I think was starting to get into science-based anything was Muscle Media 2000, which was really, and it, for people my age, that was a big change because we had Muscle and Fitness, we had Flex, we had Ironman. Those are all supplement magazine, So Muscle Media started that. But like I said, I wanted to be a better athlete than I was. I'd always been obsessed with fat loss because I was a chunky little kid,
Same.
Let's face it. Most of us are trying to fix ourselves. And if we happen to make it into a career, all the better, right? So I was always, like I said, I was never great in the weight room, but I loved it. I always loved pushing weights. So I always wanted to learn more about that and learn more about training and learn more about nutrition and performance because I wanted to be a better athlete. Then graduated college in 93, and that's when the internet started, right? In 1993, I was on AOL they sent a CD-ROM, and it had 4 free hours. That's what the internet was in 1993. And I've just been on ever since, right? I've watched it develop. My first browser in 94 was Mozilla 1. It didn't even show images. It would have a little box that said image 1 here. Like it couldn't even show graphics.
Wow.
And I just kind of, and suddenly the internet was this thing that nobody knew what it was. And I got involved in some early discussion groups. And, I love hearing myself talk. I certainly enjoyed writing. Like all new college graduates, I thought that I knew everything, ha, ha, ha. And I think was one of the first people pushing science into the field. Because at that time, it was still all, bro science and 6 meals per day and stoke your metabolism and Arnold. And I was like, well, that's not really what the research says about this. Yeah. And I don't know that I was the first, but I was certainly one of the earliest that was really, and then that sort of started to develop. And then around 97, suddenly everyone realized that there were these things called websites. And I'm sure your listeners who are younger can't even comprehend this, right? You grew up on the internet. You grew up with this.
Yeah, exactly.
I went from the time where cable TV was the most exciting thing in the world to watching the internet start, what it was early on, and develop. Because remember one year, there's a website I was writing for called Mesomorphosis, and we went to the Arnold Classic, the big bodybuilding show in Columbus. And the guy who ran it, and Millard Baker, was walking around handing out flyers going, hey, check out our website. And literally most people were like, what's a website? Right? Nobody knew what this was. Nobody knew what this was for. Nobody knew what it was. Early on, people thought it was just a fad. And now it is the fundamental component of society. So in a lot of ways, I was very much in the right place at the right time. Because I was, somebody did a podcast a while back and someone was like, when I first got online, every time I searched for a topic, you always came up. And I was like, right, I was the only one there. I've literally been, I've had a website since 98. I've literally been on the internet since it started in 1993.
Damn,
and
that was when I was born. 1 year later.
Yeah, and I mean, and and a lot of the people, the new evidence-based folks in the industry, they all told me, they're like, yeah, I grew up reading your book. I went from being, the new guy to now I'm like the old man in the field. I've been around, I've watched it change completely from what was called Usenet way back in the day, mailing lists, forums for about a decade. Then MySpace was 2005, 2006. And I never did that because I was way too old. And then that's about when Facebook started. And then, that's led to Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been there the whole way through and just kind of, in a way, got lucky. I like to think I'm good at what I do, but I really was I never had to market. I never had to advertise because I was the only person around. But I think to a very great degree, I really was one of the first pushing for any sort of evidence-based, because before that, it was just muscle magazines. It was just what sells magazines, what sells products.
Did you ever compete yourself in bodybuilding, men's physique?
No, I never had the potential. I did one powerlifting meet because I was really a better endurance athlete.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate. Like, I have really good levers for squatting and deadlifting. I've got very short legs, but I think physiologically, I was always way more successful at endurance sports. I raced inline skating for many, many years. I was in Salt Lake City and pursued ice speed skating for a bunch of years. And like, I always, like I said, I always enjoyed it. I always enjoyed pushing heavy weights. I think at the powerlifting meet I did, I don't know, 2.5 body weight deadlift and double body weight high bar squat. And I was sucked at bench because I got these long arms. So I always enjoyed it.
Genetics play such a big role in those lifts.
And in hindsight, also my testosterone, I had it measured twice, 20 years apart. It was about 290 nanograms per, like right at the low end of average. Like I said, I was built for endurance, and I was much better at it, but I always enjoyed the weight room. I also, like most people that fall into coaching, I learned most of my mistakes, or made most of my mistakes, on myself.
Yeah.
And I look back at how I trained in my 20s into my early 30s, and certainly I would do things very, very differently now. But that's always the way, right? Like by the time you know enough to help yourself, you're too old for it to matter and too tired. So, so my powerlifter, she gets to take advantage of what I've learned over the years. And, I like to think I was probably a better coach in the weight room than I was an athlete, because you also find people that are decent athletes, not great, like not genetically, like not great athletes, but good, are the ones who get obsessive about figuring out, like, how do I get that next 1%? Like, how do I optimize my nutrition, my supplements, my training, my weight room stuff? And I think they frequently make better coaches because they are the ones that spent all the time kind of figuring out. My own speed skating coach, for example, he spent 27 years analyzing this one little sport to every degree of movement throughout the entire, like he reminded me of me, because he didn't reach his athletic goals, and he became this phenomenal coach because he just was super. So that was me. I've prepped bodybuilders. I've taken people to powerlifting meets successfully. So probably a better, and like I said, I was just built for endurance sports.
Yeah. I'm in love with the research and everything that's to do with like training, nutrition, and it's all I do. So
right.
I'm coaching myself, but I'm not like coaching physique athletes, which is my goal. So I thought by myself, I cut down before and felt like shit. Right. But now I wanted to go to the next level and get into a contest prep shape and do photo shoot after, just so to show I know exactly what you're going through. I know how it is. I do not need to step on stage, but I would like to have the experience. And I can tell you, I am at the latest stages, and some parts of my body, it just will not come off.
Yeah.
And I'm doing my absolute best, and I feel like absolute garbage. It's insane. I did a photo shoot before at like, I think like 10%, 9.5. Honestly, I felt like shit already because I was a chubby kid myself. But I kind of pushed it a long time, and it always takes like longer than you expect. So I bulked up to like 83 kgs. And right now I am at 67 kgs.
Wow, that's huge. That's a huge amount of weight loss or fat loss.
Yeah, and it took me like 7 months, but I actually expected it to go a little bit faster, but it happens every time.
Yep.
And it always takes longer than expected because you have these guys that are on YouTube, other bodybuilders, they take like 3 months. But I think personally, as a natural athlete, that is very hard if you come like from 15% body fat, or maybe it has to do with genetics. I am not sure, but for me, it is like my legs are the most stubborn part of my body. And
Right.
that my goal was to have my quads like really lean.
Yeah.
And it's so hard. It just,
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the time frame thing, because like you go back, to 1970s, 1980s bodybuilding, and guys are like, yeah, I do a 12-week contest prep. Some of them would be like, I get heavier as I get to contest shape. And it was because of all the drug use. Because if you're starting at, 10 to 12% body fat, and you've got thyroid medication, clenbuterol, anabolic steroid, like you can do it in 12 weeks. But I found even early on, or the bodybuilders I knew who were natural, it didn't work. Like unless they were extremely lean to begin with. Like if they were staying 10% in the off season, then yeah, they could maybe get there in 3 months. But I think if you look at modern contest prep, most physique athletes take about 6 months to get there. Because, well, my rule of thumb is however long you think it's going to take to get to your goal, like based on the numbers, or double it at least, right? You might get there a little bit faster. It might take a little bit longer, but if you think it's going to take you 3 months, it's probably going to take you about twice that. And so yeah, the current approach is to start much earlier, because you can diet more gradually. Natural athletes, have to deal with muscle loss, metabolic slowdown, appetite, all these things that fight back, that if you have enough drugs, you will never experience, right? If you've got enough, like I said, clenbuterol, thyroid, growth hormone, testosterone, appetite suppressants during your contest, you can lose 2 pounds of fat, not lose any muscle, and get there in 12 weeks. And as a natural, you may be looking, maybe if you're bigger, half to 3/4 of a kilo a week early on, and you might have to drop that to, half a kilo or less per week as you start to get very, very lean. And assuming you don't want to lose muscle or lose performance, it does take a lot longer. What you're then sort of describing, which I think is the first topic you want to talk about, is the issue of stubborn body fat, because that is something else that people run into, both women and men. Something you often see in really genetically superior bodybuilders, they carry their fat very evenly. Right, you see them in the off season, and even though their body fat percentage is pretty high, you don't see trouble areas. Like they don't really look that, because everything is just so evenly distributed, and they lose it very evenly, and they don't really run into those trouble spots. But most people, you look at a male who's the typical male who's at 15% body fat, his legs will be ripped. Right, I've been as low as about 8% body fat. I've been mid 20% body fat. My thigh skin fold has never been above 3 millimeters. Didn't matter whether I was ripped or fat. It's never changed. But my midsection, right, that's where men typically carry their body fat, abdominal area, love handles, low back, upper back frequently. For women, you look at a woman who's at, 15% body fat, which is low for a woman. She'll have a shredded upper body, right? She'll have veins across her pecs and delts. She will have a six-pack that men would kill for. And her hips and thighs will still generally carry, just there will be no definition on average. Yeah. And that's because there are sort of typical male and female trouble spots. And it's hormonal, it's genetic, it's biological. There are exceptions though. And you are describing one. It is not unheard of for men to carry more hip and thigh fat. Right. What I expect happens to you is you get more of I hate to say a female pattern, but hopefully people listening know what I mean by that, where you probably get your upper body comes in very quickly. Yeah, exactly. But hips and thighs are always the last to go. And that's not common, but it's not unheard of. And I don't know if it's, an estrogen thing, an early programming thing. A lot of this happens very early in life, even before birth. There's a lot of biological programming that's going on. I'm sure you've seen, they've talked about, the 2 to 4 digit ratio and all this stuff that kind of indicates hormonal exposure when you're younger, whether you're exposed to elevated levels of androgens.
Do you believe in that the finger ratio? Yeah.
There's so much literature on it at this point in humans that I think there's absolutely something to it. It just correlates with too many things. And I don't really like animal research, but animal models show it, human models show it. There's differences in biological programming, bone structure. This one gets really touchy. Behavior. Women I've known that have, you know, that's more of a male-like ratio, and I always forget which is which, seem more likely to have, you know, like I said, masculine personality. I don't know who your listenership is. I live in the US, and people get so twisted over gender role stuff that if I seem overly cautious with my words, that's why. Like, I'm not using any of these terms as a negative, as saying one is superior. I'm just saying, like, as you know, people know what I mean, hopefully, but I'm not meaning it as anything beyond that. So frequently the women I've known that seem to gain muscle more easily, to have, you know, a certain body shape, have that finger digit ratio, often had more certain behavior patterns, you know, whether it was tomboyishness or, I mean, they often very much had a feminine side as well. Like, don't get me wrong, but they're seeing, so, and I think there's just too much research on it. It correlates with athletic performance. And there is stuff showing, you know, it affects brain function. It programs the body metabolically. So I think it wouldn't surprise me to find out that, like, men that have a more traditionally female body fat pattern, something was programmed early on, hormonally or biologically or whatever. We know now, like in women, polycystic ovary syndrome, which often leads to a much more male body fat patterning, that may be related to women who are exposed to high levels of testosterone in the womb. So there's something to it. Does it explain everything? Absolutely not. But it is part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And this sort of brings us, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm very curious about why it is so hard to lose that last bit of fat, because I gotta say, I'm actually pretty ready, but it's just my legs, and it's frustrating, you know?
So there's a number of things going on, right? So back in the day, we just thought of, like, okay, there's body fat. And now we divide it. There's visceral fat, right? That's the stuff that's kind of deep around the gut. And then there's subcutaneous fat. That's the fat that's underneath the skin. But even that shows different behaviors depending on where it is in the body. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this in terms of the details, but there can be differences in things like blood flow, how well that fat, that area of fat stores fat. More importantly, how easily it releases fat in response to hormonal signals. So, and they've done a lot of different stuff. Mainly they focus on kind of the abdominal area and the hip and thigh area. I think I found one study on women's breasts, but there's not a lot of research on that. And what you sort of end up finding is that there's this cluster of things where visceral fat is the easiest to lose. It's got a lot of blood flow. It's very easily mobilized for energy. It's very metabolically active, right? Which is part of the problem. If you carry a lot of visceral fat, it's dumping fatty acids into the bloodstream, which causes health problems. But if you start exercising and dieting, it goes away the fastest.
Yeah, I mentioned it when I just started and I lost my like 5 first kgs. I have it on video as well on my YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. You don't see a lot of difference. That is very, and if I look at in the mirror, I think, like, what is happening? Nothing is happening. I'm losing weight, but gotta trust the process.
But what happens is, and I bet you experience this, you feel leaner. Like, it's hard to describe if you haven't, like, when you carry a lot of visceral fat, you just feel thick around the middle. Like, it's just, if you poke, it's just really firm, and you can't really suck your stomach in and do a stomach vacuum. And when you lose that visceral fat, which comes off first, there's not a lot of visual appearance. Like, your waist may be a little bit narrower, but you just feel leaner inside. You feel like it's hard.
A little bit of a smaller person.
Yeah, that's a really, it's a very good way of describing it. And so once that's gone, then you sort of lose fat kind of from the top down, right? It's kind of inside out. And so what happens? Usually face tends to get a little bit gaunt and lean, right? And if you look at like physique athletes at the end stages of dieting, their face looks frequently very unhealthy. Like the fat has just collapsed, right? Their cheeks are sunken. It's not a healthy look.
No.
You know, delts and pecs start to come in better than kind of abdominal area. And even in the abdominal fat, they have defined now there's visceral fat real deep inside. There's a deep abdominal area that's then there's a superficial abdominal area. That's the stuff that we see. And then there's a superficial upper and superficial lower abdominal area. And they're all a little bit different, right? So you lose visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat, the upper abdominal fat, and then the lower abdominal, right? And as a man or even as a woman, upper abs always come in first. And then you've got that little bit of kind of a ring of fat around the lower area. You may have it on, you know, the obliques, the love handles, the low back. Excuse me. And then that comes in next. People it's funny, on my forums or my Facebook group, guys, they'll be like, man, I've been dieting forever and I'm lean everywhere, but I've still got this fat around my lower abdominal area. What's wrong with me? And I said, well, you're a guy. That's what's wrong with you. This is just the normal pattern for males. Now, women lose that way too, right? They lose kind of upper body. So their shoulders, pecs get ripped. They get this six pack that men would kill for. Because once the abs are gone, the next set, which is hips and thighs, which is the hardest to lose. And for a few reasons. One, the blood flow is very poor, right? If you put your hand on it, it's cold to the touch. It's very poor blood flow. It can store fat somewhat easily after a meal. But more importantly, it's very, very, very hard to mobilize fatty acids out of the fat cell, right? And if you can't do that, right, that's kind of the first critical step to lose fat. So you have to get the fatty acid, the fat out of the fat cell. Then it goes in the bloodstream, and then hopefully it goes into the blood where it can get burned by heart, liver, muscle, whatever. But lower body, hip, and thigh fat is the hardest to mobilize in the first place. And if you can't do that, you can't lose it. And it's all hormonal. And like I said, there's articles on my website about this. I don't want to get too deep into the details because it'll take too long. So all these different areas, right? You go from visceral fat, very easily to mobilize. So it's very easy to lose. Then you've got, the deep abdominal fat, a little bit harder, upper abdominal fat, a little bit harder, lower abdominal fat, little hip and thigh fat, the hardest.
Yeah.
And it's just the biology of those fat cells. There's even differences in the types of fat, the types of fatty acids different fat cells store, right? Because as it turns out, and again, this is just one of those little trivial fun facts, it's easier to get unsaturated fats out of a fat cell than saturated fats.
Oh, for real?
Yeah, like I don't know if the difference is huge, but and like its chain length and a bunch of other things. Well, stubborn fat tends to store more saturated fat. Because again, if you feel it, it's almost harder to the touch too, right? It feels different than other parts of the body.
Definitely.
So it's cold. So there's all these factors that are going into this. And now, from a woman's standpoint, the reason for this is that the hip and thigh fat is meant to fuel pregnancy. If she becomes pregnant, because this is over a decade ago. Once women, I want to say second trimester of pregnancy, but definitely into breastfeeding, women's hip and thigh fat becomes the easiest to mobilize. Something happens where it switches from being the hardest to get rid of to the easiest, right? Because you will talk to women, and when they're breastfeeding, assuming they don't really, even without dieting, they're like, oh my God, body fat drops off. My hips and thigh fat dropped off like nobody's business because those calories are meant to help support breastfeeding. And I spent about a year trying to figure out, okay, can I mimic this somehow? Is there some way I can manipulate this hormonally or nutritionally or whatever to try to mimic what happens in breastfeeding? And I couldn't get anywhere with the project, so I gave up. So that's what, now in men we might, okay, why would a man store fat down there? I can't think of a good reason. I think it's just one of those, something happened early in development or early in biology, like I said, could have been when your mom was pregnant. fetal development, there's a big concern with, estrogenic compounds in the environment that can cause all kinds of, I don't know why it happens. It simply does for some men. And so for men, again, your upper body will come in great, but just like a woman's body, your hip and thigh fat is going to be the most resistant to loss.
Yeah.
Now that said, I'll say one more thing and I'll let you talk. What I found when I've prepped people, women that had that pattern, is what will happen, right, is for months, nothing, or it'll go down a little bit, right? Their upper body just shredded.
Yeah.
So it's always been one of the ironies, right? Men want a six-pack and have shredded legs. Women want shredded legs and have a six-pack. And each one wants what the other one has. And thus the balance of the universe is maintained. Each one would kill for what the other has. But once that hip and thigh fat starts to move, you get to a point that there's nothing else to lose. So either that fat's going to come off or you're going to lose muscle. Those are the only real options left. So when that body fat does finally start to move towards the end of a woman's diet, and here we're talking about, 15% body fat and below for women. Right?
Yeah.
10% is about the low limit for women, which is about the equivalent of 8% in a man, right? Most guys, they'll get to 10, 12% and still not have a full six-pack. By the time you get to that sub-single digit level, but when the abs start to come in, they come in fast. And it's the same thing in reverse. So women will get there and it's like, man, not a lot of change. And then boom, overnight, they start to see visual changes. But they have to get pretty lean for that to happen. And
but
it's harder dieting than most people want to go through.
Yeah, and let's just say that I'm at the latest stages. My cardio is high. My steps are high. My calories are low. What would you recommend to get that last bit of fat off? Would you because I am losing the weight gradually. Because I'm already really lean. So is it okay at the last stage to get the last bit of fat off? Do you think it's a good idea to go really low calorie, protein modified sparing fast or intermittent fasting, some protocols that might work? Or is it just calories in, calories out and be patient?
It's a little bit of both. And actually, one of it is be patient, with men especially, right? And they're what do I do? Men's abdominal fat is not nearly as stubborn as women's hip and thigh fat, biologically or otherwise. For men, it really is a matter of patience. For women, it can be as well, but it can be a lot of patience. Mm-hmm. There are strategies, and I wrote that book, The Stubborn Fat Solution, I want to say 2008, I think, because that was an interest of mine for about a decade. I read something by a previous expert, a guy named Dan Duchesne, and for about a decade, I just kind of accumulated thoughts and ideas and research and literature, and then finally one day I was like, yeah, I think I'm gonna write this book now. But it's the book itself didn't take very long, but it was the culmination of 10 years of paying attention to research, because there are ways to overcome that resistance to mobilization. Like I said, I don't want to get too deep into the whys hormonally. Like I said, you can read the book. I think it's in one of my articles. I'm sure there's an article called, What is Stubborn Fat on my website somewhere that sort of gets into the details of this. And there's a few different ones. And I talked about this in my book because not everyone is appropriate for every individual, right? I wanted to give as many different options as I could. So this can be integrated with your preferred diet, how you're doing cardio, whatever it is. So one of them is actually, some very early research showed that 4 days of a very low carb diet, right? Like a ketogenic type diet, for whatever reason, made that hip and lower body fat easier to mobilize. And I don't know if they ever figured out what the mechanism was, but it didn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter. It worked. So that is one approach, right? If you've read my old Ultimate Diet 2, which I wrote long before Stubborn Fat, it ends up kind of accidentally including some of the ideas I came up with later, because it's about 4.5 days of very low carbs, and you get some of that benefit. the thing is, not everyone likes low carb diets. Some people feel terrible on them. Some people just, they feel miserable.
Yeah.
Headaches, loss of concentration, depends. So that's not always an option. So the second option I discussed was a supplement called Yohimbine, or Yohimbine, which is Yohimbine. And so we go back in the time machine. Way back in the day, nobody knew anything about anything, right? You read the old research and it's great, but it's like nobody. And so Yohimbine was found to help with erectile dysfunction. It helped men get erections. Now, you will still see it talked about as a testosterone booster, because back in the day, if something helped with sexual arousal, people just assumed it must be hormonal. But in this case, it's not. Yohimbine is impacting blood flow to pretty much the whole body. And of course, the genitals are one of them, right? That's how Viagra and Cialis work. Yohimbine is a different mechanism than those two. But it happens to also it improves blood flow to fat cells. So I don't want to get too much into the details. I'll just say it makes it easier to mobilize fatty acids out of stubborn fat cells.
Yeah. All right.
The details aren't that important. It's inhibiting a specific receptor that is making it more difficult. So it's kind of whatever. So that is another option, but that's also not for everybody. It can cause anxiety. It can cause jitters. If you're a male, I used it when I was younger. If you take it before your morning cardio and go to the gym and see someone that is very attractive to you, you may very likely get aroused, because it is going to increase blood, so this is, for women too. Women will get some tingles frequently because they're getting increased blood flow down there as well. But it's also not legal everywhere, right? You can't get it in a lot of countries. So I'm spoiled in the US. We can get anything we want, for good or for bad. So that was an option, but not required, and it's not for everybody. People who are prone to anxiety should absolutely not take it. So then I think the other thing the other strategies I proposed, and again, it's be easier to explain with the details, but just trust me on this. So when you exercise, the two big hormones involved in fat mobilization are adrenaline or epinephrine, depending on what country you live in. We call it adrenaline. The rest of the world calls it epinephrine. It's released from the adrenal gland. It is involved in fat mobilization. There's a second hormone called noradrenaline or norepinephrine. Very chemically similar. It's released from nerve terminals, right? So nerves come down and here's a fat cell and here's a nerve terminal. So adrenaline would be released into the bloodstream. Noradrenaline is released right where it's right at that tissue. And as it turns out in stubborn fat, you need to jack up noradrenaline to get optimal fat mobilization. I think that's the simplest way I can put it. So the other take home of this is, if you look at exercise intensity, as you start cardio intensity, for example, just exercise intensity. At low intensities, your body only releases adrenaline or epinephrine. And it releases more and more and more and more and more, so you hit a certain threshold. And that threshold is where it's the intensity where above that point, you would be doing interval training, like high intensity intervals. Yeah. Right. Once you get above this hormone, this threshold intensity, you can't continue for long periods of time. But for whatever reason, the body starts pumping out noradrenaline. And that helps to mobilize stubborn fat. So
is there a way you can notice that?
Not that I'm aware of, in terms of I don't think you could measure. They've done, they do it in research, and they measure bloodstream and look at the levels of all this. I don't think in practice we could, other than to know that it occurs.
It's very funny now you mention it. I actually did cardio today for an hour, and it was hard. It was very hard. And at the beginning, I experienced being cold all the time. So at the beginning, I'm not sweating. But in those last 40 minutes or 35 minutes, I'm sweating and I'm warm. Also, if I'm like walking outside, maybe that has something to do with it?
Yeah, which is probably just like changes in blood flow and things of all, all that nature. Now what's sort of, again, kind of interesting, you go back to like the 70s and the 80s, right? How people, dieted. They trained, they cut their calories, they did the hour low intensity walk every morning. Mm-hmm. Now that would get men in shape, and women frequently, the hip and thigh fat just wouldn't come off. Just didn't seem to be as effective, especially when they were doing very high carb diets. So lower carb diets helped. But then I found some, and they see the same thing in research studies. Like, all right, we took a bunch of women, gave them an exercise program, and they lost only upper body fat, because that's what you would expect in a woman carrying any significant amount of body fat. But there were a couple that were like, well, we had them do high intensity weight training. They had some high intensity component of that activity. And then they noticed, oh, well, the body fat loss was a little more even. Rather than it being 100% from the upper body, they lost some lower body fat too. And that's kind of like the secret message of those papers. It's like, okay, you need some intensity in there, right? The old approach of dieting, which was high carb, low fat, and nothing but low intensity cardio, kind of doesn't get it done. And whereas, and someone, again, I did a podcast whenever, and someone said, okay, you wrote this book in 2008. In 2020, where does the stubborn fat, where does that concept fall? Because a lot of coaches will say, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen stubborn fat. What's going on? And the difference is, if you look at modern contest dieting, it's very different now than it was 10 years ago. Because 10 or 15 years ago, again, everyone did high carb, low fat, low intensity cardio. Now, protein intakes are higher, fat intakes are higher, carbohydrate intakes are much more moderate, and people are doing more intensity. They're doing high intensity intervals once or twice a week. They're basically, in a sense, they've kind of integrated some of the protocols that I wrote about as just a standard part of contest dieting.
Yeah.
So these two protocols I came up with, like, I needed to find a way to kind of leverage both parts of it, because high intensity activity, like interval training, or even like higher repetition, short rest weight training, like it doesn't have to be like bike intervals or cardio intervals, generates this great hormonal response. However, doesn't burn a lot of calories. For some reasons, even though it sends a signal to mobilize fatty acids, it can trap them inside the fat cell, right? Because something that can happen, right, is, say you've got a fat cell. If you mobilize a fatty acid out of it, and the blood flow is not very good, it'll just go right back in and get stored.
Wow, that's...
Women's bodies are amazing. Women's bodies can mobilize fat from the upper body. And if it doesn't get burned off for fuel, for energy, it can get stored in the lower body. Women's bodies hate them. Because like back in the day, women would say, look, I'm dieting, I'm getting leaner in my upper body, but my lower body is getting fatter. We all said, nah, can't be, but it's true. So you have to first mobilize the fatty acid, have blood flow, get it away from the fat cell, so it can't just go right back in. But then you have to burn it off for energy.
Yeah.
So the protocols that I came up with, there are two different ones that were just variations on the theme. The first one, you start with a short interval workout. So you'll warm up, do maybe 5 by 45 to 60 seconds hard, like above your sustainable threshold. Rest a minute hard, rest a minute. It could be 30 seconds, whatever. Do 5 reps, and then what that's doing is that's jacking up noradrenaline, norepinephrine levels. It's getting that hormonal response to mobilize those fatty acids. But now once they're mobilized, you need to burn them off. So now you go get a drink of water, rest a couple minutes, and then you follow that up with 20 to 40 minutes of regular cardio to burn off the fatty acid. So that was the first stubborn fat protocol. Do a short interval workout. And like I said, it doesn't have to be bike or elliptical or rowing. Like if you want to go do like, sort of a metabolic weight training workout or battle ropes or whatever it is, doesn't matter. It just has to be that 5 or 10
Intense.
minutes of really intense activity. Well, you want the hormonal response.
Yeah.
How you get it is less important. To get that mobilization going, then you go do some moderate intensity cardio to burn the fatty acids off. And then the second protocol is just a variation on that theme. You started with short intervals to really get a really, really intense hormonal response, did your cardio, and you actually finished with another short interval workout to get whatever calorie burn, after calorie burn you're going to get. That one was too intense for most people. But even doing, the protocol one, short interval workout, rest a few minutes, steady state cardio, a couple times a week, that's frequently all it really takes to get that mobilized, assuming you're still in a calorie deficit. The nice thing about that protocol is you don't have to change your diet, right? You don't have to be on a low carb diet. You don't have to take a supplement that maybe is not good for you or you can't get. You don't have to change your entire training structure. That was the issue with the Ultimate Diet too, is unless you're able to train exactly like it said, you couldn't really use its principles. The stubborn fat protocols were meant to okay, I don't know how you train. I don't know how many days you train. I don't know what you do, what your diet is. These protocols can be inserted as needed.
Yeah.
Now you have to be careful. If you're training legs heavy twice a week during a diet and you try to throw 2 high intensity interval workouts on top of that, that may be too much for your legs, right? It's very easy to overdo it when you're dieting on low calories.
Yeah.
So, if you're doing 2 heavy leg training days a week, you may only be able to do that protocol once a week.
Yeah.
Alternately, go ahead.
Now you also mentioned that I also want to talk about water retention. And
Sure.
what I noticed is I did a lot of cardio. I train my legs 2 times a week. I walk 20,000 steps every day.
Wow. Okay.
20,000 steps. And on top of that, I also do cardio. But what I experience now, when I was standing on the scale, I'm weighing myself 7 days a week, taking the average, normal.
Yep. Good.
1 week, I lost 600 grams. The other week, I did exactly the same. I tracked everything. So 1 week, I gained 200 grams in a week.
Right.
And what I experienced was a lot of leg edema. So very weird. And I know a lot of people struggle with this. They look at their weight and the scale doesn't move. And I have this exact same thing. And sometimes for weeks on end, I'm I know I'm in a deficit. I feel like shit. But the weight doesn't change.
Yes.
And eventually you see a drop. And
overnight. Yes.
I cannot explain that. And it's boggling my mind for such a long time because I still experience it. And
Stop.
And
no, not you, my dog.
Yeah, I know. And I actually stopped weighing myself because I knew I get a little bit obsessive, so I'm just doing caliper measurements for now.
And this is, again, it's not universal, but it's common. And I found this for myself years ago because I'm I'm a little neurotic, let's be honest, and that's being polite. And when I dieted in my 20s, I got very intense, right? I was doing, daily cardio, and it's cut calories more. Again, this was kind of goes to what we talked about, is it's so hard to coach yourself because I would do things. Yeah. I would do things in my own training and diet that I never would let anybody else do. Exactly. But I would I'd be like, well, I'm experimenting. I'm this. And I would just do myself more harm than good. And I noticed that. And other people have too. And it's exactly like you described. They know they're doing everything right? Their calories are where they need to be. They're doing the morning cardio. They're lifting. Everything's right. And nothing's happening. Or their weight goes up a little bit. And this will happen for, 2-3 weeks. And a couple things can happen. One, a lot of people will just be like, you know what? Screw this. They'll take a day off because they're sick of this crap. And then they'll wake up 2 kilos lighter and be like, what the hell? And then they'll go right back to dieting too hard. That's what I dealt with a lot of personal training clients when I was younger. Or sometimes it just takes about 3 weeks. And overnight, there's what I call a whoosh. That's a word that's been in the diet world for years, where it's just like, normally we think of fat loss or weight loss. It's like, oh, you're losing, half to 3/4 or maybe 1 kilo a week. And everybody wants it to be like this. And it's not. And you'll lose, and then you'll stall, and then overnight, it'll be like, I woke up 1.5 kilos lighter. What the hell is going on? And I've long believed that it is, I think there's no doubt that it's water retention, right? Because it has to be, right? It can't be really anything else. You're not gaining fat in a deficit. You're probably not gaining muscle in deficit under most conditions. If you're weighing daily, certainly, it's not like you're seeing those day-to-day fluctuations in body weight. Like, because what some people will do, like, oh, I weigh every Monday. That's just a non-starter, because any given day, did you poo? How many, there's so many variables. Yeah. But when you're weighing weekly and averaging it, that shouldn't be an issue. And yet here it is. And something is going on. I know some people that used bioelectrical impedance scales, which I don't think of very much of generally. But what they would always see was a big change in the measurement, like right before the big drop. Like there was because those things are measuring water in the body, right? Yeah. Conductivity and water levels, something like that. So this is all anecdotal. I've never seen this studies. Researchers don't study stuff like this because it doesn't occur to them. But something does happen. And actually, if you go back, right, so in the 1950s, there's this famous experiment called the Minnesota semi-starvation study, right? It gets talked about all the time. It was a military thing. They took, for 6 months, they took war objectors. They put them on 50% maintenance calories, 2 hours of forced walking a day, had to work. They weren't weight trained, very low protein. And even then they noted towards the end of the diet, some people, their body, and I mean, every calorie was controlled, right? These guys were basically, they weren't locked in prison, but they might as well. There was no cheating going on. There was no access to food. Every morsel was measured. Like literally after their food they would rinse it with water and make them drink, like every calorie was accounted for. And some of the people, their predicted weight loss curve, they fell off of it. And what was noted, it was known for years, was they showed incredible puffiness in the lower body, in the ankles. When you get that water retention, right, you push into the skin and it sort of, and then it just very slowly comes back out. And there was a thing called starvation edema, which edema just means water retention, that was known of for years. Now, I've always thought that it was probably due to elevated cortisol levels, right? Dieting raises cortisol, exercise raises cortisol. Being crazy in the head raises cortisol. Like, again, we're all a little bit neurotic. Yeah. There's a certain personality type, certain obsessive personality type, and I'm one of them, that you just stress so hard about it. Cortisol can cause water retention. Now some other more recent stuff, a lot of people in the field think I'm full of shit, and that's fine. It may not be cortisol related, but there is something going on, and I don't think anyone can deny that. And you frequently see it, like I said, in certain clusters of behaviors where there's a lot of intense weight training, a lot of cardio, a lot of activity in general, low calories, a little bit of crazy going on. Those are the folks that seem to get it the worst. And something I found when I went from my 20s to my 30s, the less stressed I got about fat loss, the more effectively it happened. The less worried I was on a day-to-day basis. Because I did. You've probably done this too. You're taking caliper measurements twice a day. You're like, there's the old joke about weighing before and after you go to the bathroom to see if you've gone, you can get really, really crazy about this.
I know.
And it's, it's easy to say, stop being a crazy person, but that doesn't really work very well. So something is going on, and people, sometimes it just eventually resolves itself. There's another thing I've written about, and there's a lot of debate over this. When I was in college, my physiology professor told us that what happens is when you lose fat, right, you get the fat out of the fat cells fill back up with water. And then eventually that water has to be dropped. I'm the first, I guarantee you, people share these Instagram memes all the time. And I'm like, guys, I wrote about that in 1999. Can you please maybe give me an IO or 2000? No, 1999. I'm like, can you please give me an IO of credit? I guarantee you never heard about this till I talked about it. And my professor told me that there was no data. I looked for years. There's one study in obese men that their visceral fat area filled back up with water. I'm not saying it happens. Something is going on, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm willing, like I said, decade after the fact, I would like to see more data on it. something is happening, right? In fact, it's sort of this squishy feel to it.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense because the weight doesn't change. It's anecdotal with me.
Right.
And also with my clients, the weight doesn't change, but they get leaner and they do not look like puffy. So something
is happening.
Yeah.
And a couple of other, again, somewhat anecdotal data points. I'm willing to, I've talked to some coaches, and another thing that's become very much more common in the modern era is, having, I called them refeeds originally when I wrote about flexible dieting in 2004, right? It actually goes back to one of your early questions, the whole evidence-based thing, right? Yeah. In 2004, I was like, okay, look, there is a good, not dieting completely clean, not having these rigid eating patterns. You should take breaks during your diet. Nobody was ready to listen because everybody knew you dieted the way Arnold dieted. You dieted the way the physique, you ate clean for 6 months straight or however long you could survive it. And that's how you got into shape. So for me to come along and go, actually, you'll get better results by doing these things. Nobody was ready to listen in 2004. Now, 15, 16 years later, that's all anybody talks about. Oh, crap. Give me 1 second.
I will not keep you up for longer.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Let me just send this text really quickly. But one thing, so now people really integrate these things. They have days at calorie maintenance for a number of reasons, hormonal, metabolic. And the coaches I've talked to that do this find that the water retention issue is much less pronounced. Because when you raise calories to maintenance, it kind of reverses a lot of those hormonal effects. Cortisol comes back down. It gives your body a break. You'll have to take a day off from training if they can. So there's something going on. Yeah. And it seems like the more intense you get, the more extreme you get with your diet, the more likely it is to occur. And if you kind of chill a little bit,
would you need to
it's adjust, not quite as pronounced.
Would you need to adjust the weekly deficit? Or can you still be in a deficit weekly and 1 day of maintenance?
Yes. Yeah, and that's the thing. And what a lot of them do, for physique athletes, they have to be in shape by a specific day, right? They have to get a very specific. So that's different than general dieting when you generally don't have a certain, you've got a photo shoot scheduled, obviously. So what the coaches will do, they're like, all right, I want a certain weekly deficit. Let's say it's just 7. Let's say it doesn't matter. Let's say it's 2,100 calories a week, 300 calories a day. Mm-hmm. If they take 1 day to maintenance, right, they have to take that 300 calorie deficit they just lost and spread it to the other days or put it on another one of those days. So they keep the weekly deficit the same by making the 6 diet days a little bit harder and including the 1 maintenance day. Yeah. And many have reported to me that, and at the end of the diet, they may be doing 2 maintenance days a week. So they've got 5 harder dieting days and 2 days at maintenance, calorie maintenance with elevated carbs, or whatever the specifics are. So yeah, and even, you can trick the system briefly. My Ultimate Diet 2 did this where you had, you can have even a very high calorie day above maintenance. And when you're depleted of muscle glycogen, of calories, those calories tend to just go into the muscle.
Yeah.
And you can almost, the body will almost keep burning fat for a short period of time. But in general, that seems to help. For some people, like water loading for 3 days, drinking extra water kind of helps tune down some of the hormones involved in water retention. That often helps with that. So yeah, but for people, when it occurs, it's a very real thing. And the mistake I see people make, and I made it, is when you hit that stall, what do you mentally think you should do?
Go
Diet
harder.
even harder.
Yeah.
And that makes it worse. Where sometimes the best thing you can do is just take a day off. Just take a day off from training, from cardio, raise your calories a little bit, or even just bring them to maintenance for a day. And frequently that will trigger that overnight loss. And then you can go back to dieting like a crazy person, which is what we all do. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I really want to thank you for your time, Lyle.
Oh no, thank you for having me.
It was a good conversation, and I know my audience will truly like it. And I also learned a lot today. So
oh, good. Thank you.
It's great. Where can people find you?
So my website has been around forever. It's called bodyrecomposition.com. It's got 400 articles on just about anything you can care to think of. That will get you to my store.bodyrecomposition.com. I think I've written 14 books at this point on all kinds of different topics about nutrition. Several are very technical. The women's book, for women's physiology, which is a whole separate discussion we can have at some later date. Also just got, my rapid fat loss handbook, stubborn fat solution, which goes into all the details of what we discussed. I'm also offering consults, hour consults. I'm not doing regular coaching just yet. The best place, probably the most regular place to find you is my Facebook group, which is also called bodyrecomposition.com. It's very active. I got tons of smart people. I tend to attract experts in their own field. So any question I can't address, I'll have like 6 people that have experienced it and 3 physicians who my group blows my mind every day. Like I learn so much from the people in my group because they're got like 5 top-notch physiotherapists, great OBGYN, several physicians. Like I've got an Instagram it's McDonald Lyle. It's mainly dumb jokes when I bother to post on it at all. And I'll share new content there. But I'm not an Instagram person. I'm too old. I should probably change. So my website for my articles, store for my books, and then my Facebook group, if you've got questions, concern, like we do everything, we can look at exercise technique, said a lot of disease stuff, thyroid issues, anything you care to name, somebody in my group will know about it.
All right, cool. I will put it in the description, guys. So be sure to check it out and subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you next time. Much love.
All right, thank you.